This is Samuel, and he was about to be convicted of a crime he did not commit, with the weight of cold handcuffs on his wrists and the scornful gaze of an entire courtroom on his shoulders. That was the moment when the faith of a good man would be crushed under the hammer of human justice, a humiliation that seemed certain and inevitable. Have you ever had your faith tested to the point where you felt that God had forgotten you? Before I tell you how God acted in his life, at the exact instant, the judge lifted his pen to sign his conviction. Comment here where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss what happens when we place an impossible injustice in his hands. The air in the courtroom was heavy, almost unbreathable. The high dark walls seemed to shrink, pressing in on Samuel from all sides. He felt the weight not only of the judicial system, but of centuries of distrust placed upon the color of his skin. The prosecutor, a woman in an impeccable suit and a smug smile, had just finished her closing argument, painting him as an agitator, a dangerous element that needed to be removed from society for the common good. Every word was a stab, a cruel distortion of the man he was, of the pastor who dedicated his days to serving the community that the system so despised. The silence that followed was even worse, filled only with the certainty of the imminent conviction. Samuel looked at his own hands, hands that had held his. Children held the Bible in countless services, served soup to the hungry, and extended peace in the midst of fights. Now they were joined by cold metal, symbolizing the guilt being imposed on him. He didn't feel anger, which was strange. He felt a deep sadness, a pain that came from the soul, seeing how the world of men was quick to judge and slow to understand. He could feel his wife Sarah's gaze burning on his back, a mixture of anguish and silent prayer. He knew that her faith was also being tested in that soulless cubicle, and that hurt more than the accusation itself. Judge Arnaldo, seated on his elevated chair like a sovereign on his throne, observed Samuel with a calculated coldness. To him, this was just another case, another face that fit the profile he saw every day, a black man from the outskirts involved in trouble. The police report was clear. The witnesses, the officers themselves, were emphatic. There was no room for doubt in his mind, only for the application of the law, harsh and blind. He saw Samuel's serenity not as a sign of innocence or faith, but as an affront, a passivity that, in his worldview, bordered on a confession of guilt or, worse, the arrogance of someone who thinks they are untouchable. In the audience, a small group from the Seed of Hope Church clung to faith like a lifeboat on the high seas. They were few, but their presence was a beacon of human warmth in that cold room. They prayed in whispers, asking for a miracle, a divine intervention that could break the cold logic of that place. They knew Pastor Samuel. They knew his heart, his works, his infinite patience with the youth no one else wanted to be around. Seeing him there, treated like a criminal, was a blow to the community's own faith. Where was God when one of his most faithful servants was being publicly humiliated for a lie? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. The prosecutor had been relentless. She used the fact that Samuel was in the middle of a gang fight as proof of his participation. She completely ignored the testimony of the teenager he protected, claiming the boy was just being loyal to his boss. She turned an act of courage into a dispute over territory. A wolf in sheep's clothing was how she described him. The phrase echoed in Samuel's mind, a grotesque perversion of everything he believed and lived. He felt the venom of veiled prejudice, the way his identity as a pastor was used against him, as if it were a disguise for illicit activities. The injustice was so palpable he could almost touch it. The defense attorney, a young and overworked public defender, had done what he could. He presented Samuel's community work, the letters of support from the neighborhood, but his argument seemed to hit a wall of indifference. Faced with the police report and Judge Arnaldo's firm stance, the defense sounded weak, almost naive. Samuel saw the discouragement in his own lawyer's eyes and understood that, for the justice of men, the battle was already lost. His only hope was no longer in codes and laws, but in a much higher authority, one that could not be seen or heard in that courtroom. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment and remembered the day of the altercation, the sound of screams, the fear in the cornered boy's eyes, the smell of gunpowder from a shot fired into the air. He remembered placing himself in front of the boy, arms outstretched, not as an aggressor, but as a shield. He didn't think about the consequences, only about protecting that young and frightened life. When the police siren sounded, he felt a momentary relief, which soon turned into astonishment when the weapons were turned on him. The image the police constructed, that of a large black man in the center of a fight, sealed his fate before he could even say a word. The judge cleared his throat, bringing Samuel back to the present. The sound broke the tense silence, a harbinger of the verdict. He adjusted his glasses, leafed through the papers one last time, and his face showed not the slightest hesitation. The decision was made. He looked at the prosecutor, who nodded with an air of victory. He looked at the defense, who bowed his head in defeat. And finally, he fixed his gaze on Samuel. It was a look that didn't see a man, a father, a pastor. It saw only a case number, a problem to be solved, an example to be made. In that moment, Samuel understood the absolute loneliness of being at the mercy of a power that does not care to know the truth. Defendant, rise. Judge Arnaldo's voice cut through the air like a blade, and Samuel obeyed, feeling his entire body weigh a ton. Every movement was a monumental effort. The sound of his own body moving, the creaking of the wooden bench, seemed to echo throughout the hall. He stood up straight and faced the judge, not with defiance, but with a quiet dignity that seemed to bother the magistrate even more. As a formality, a final ritual before the sentence, the judge asked, his voice devoid of any emotion, "Do you have anything to say in your defense before I pass sentence?" The question hung in the air, an empty offer, a perfunctory gesture that no one expected to change anything. In that instant, a universe of reactions went through the room. The prosecutor let out an almost imperceptible sigh, a gesture of annoyance as if preparing to hear a desperate plea or an angry denial that would only confirm her thesis. Sarah, in the audience, held her breath. So tightly she felt a pain in her chest, a thread of hope mixed with terror, the prayer on her lips that Samuel would find the right words, the words that could touch that heart of stone. The church members bowed their heads, their prayers intensifying. This was the moment. Either God would manifest through the mouth of his servant, or silence would confirm the victory of injustice. The world seemed to have stopped spinning, waiting for his voice. Inside Samuel, a storm was brewing. The human part, the flesh, wanted to scream. It wanted to roar his innocence, to point a finger at the police officers who lied, at the prosecutor who distorted the truth, at the judge who refused to see. It wanted to plead for his family, for his church, for his freedom. He remembered the previous night in the cold cell when he asked God in a whisper why he was being tested in this way, why his silence was so deafening. The temptation to fight with the world's weapons, with anger and accusation, was immense, a whirlwind that threatened to swallow the peace he had so carefully cultivated in his heart. But then something changed. Amidst the chaos of his thoughts, a clarity descended upon him, gentle and powerful, like an underground current. He was not there to fight against men, but to bear witness to a faith that transcends circumstances. To fight with anger would be to give them the victory. It would be to become the man they had painted. His true strength was not in proving his innocence to that court, but in demonstrating his unwavering trust in the only judge who matters. He took a deep breath and the storm calmed. His body relaxed, his shoulders dropped slightly, and a serenity took over his features. He was not surrendering. He was surrendering to a higher power. He opened his mouth, and the voice that came out was not that of a defeated man. It was firm, clear, and filled with a peace that no one in the room could comprehend. "Your Honor," he began, his gaze fixed on the judge, yet seeming to see something far beyond. "The only thing I have to say is that I trust the judge above all judges. May his will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." The words echoed in the sepulchral silence of the courtroom. There was no plea, no anger, no fear. There was only an absolute surrender, a declaration of faith so pure and disarming that it unsettled everyone. He was no longer playing their game. He was on a completely different plane. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer the quiet of expectation, but the silence of shock, of discomfort. The prosecutor frowned, confused. The response didn't fit into any category she knew. It wasn't a confession, nor a denial, nor an appeal. It was something she didn't know how to refute. The defense attorney looked at his client with a mixture of admiration and astonishment. Even the guards seemed momentarily paralyzed. The authority of the court, with its rules and its cold logic, had been challenged. Not by a legal argument, but by a spiritual force they could not measure or comprehend. Samuel's peace was an anomaly in that environment of conflict. Judge Arnaldo was the most affected, though he tried not to show it. He, a man of the law, of the concrete, of the probable, felt deeply irritated. He interpreted Samuel's calm and his words not as faith, but as the height of arrogance. To him, this defendant was using religion as a final act of defiance, placing himself above the authority of the court. This man was not just refusing to ask for clemency. He was, in the judge's distorted view, mocking the system he represented. The pastor's serenity, instead of softening the judge's heart, hardened it even more. The injustice was about to deepen, fueled by a tragic misunderstanding. For Sarah, however, those words were like a balm. The tears that came to her eyes were no longer of despair, but of a deep recognition. This was her Samuel, the man whose faith was not just for the pulpits and sunny days, but for cold cells and unjust courts. She saw the strength she had always admired in him, the rock upon which he had built his life and his family. In that moment, she understood that victory would not perhaps be acquittal. The victory had already happened in her husband's soul, which refused to be broken, to be contaminated by hatred. Her prayer changed. It was no longer for him to be free, but for God's will, whatever it was, to be done. Regaining his composure, the judge clenched his fists on the bench, his irritation visible on his face. This spectacle of faith had gone on long enough. "Very well," he said, his voice icy and cutting, overflowing with sarcasm. "Your trust has been duly noted in the records." He picked up the pen with a sharp gesture, a movement that sealed Samuel's fate. The sound of the pen's tip hitting the paper was like a shot to the heart of Sarah and the church members. It was the end. The hammer of human justice was about to fall, driven by anger and prejudice. Samuel's faith had made him strong on the inside, but it seemed to have condemned him even more in the eyes of the world. But then, as part of the final protocol before signing the sentence, Judge Arnaldo turned to the clerk, his voice still laden with impatience. "Confirm the defendant's full name and the address of his institution for the final record. I want everything correct." It was a bureaucratic act, a tedious formality he had to perform, a mere line in a document, an insignificant detail amidst the gravity of the conviction. He didn't even look at Samuel as he gave the order. Little did he know that it was not his pen, but the voice of that clerk that was about to deliver the true sentence that day. The clerk, a middle-aged man with glasses on the tip of his nose, cleared his throat and adjusted the papers in front of him. In a monotone voice, as if reading a shopping list, he began to dictate the data for the record. Name: Samuel da Costa. Judge Arnaldo kept his gaze fixed on the document, the pen hovering over the dotted line, ready to deliver the final blow. The room was in a deathly silence, every breath held, every heart beating to a funereal rhythm. Sarah closed her eyes, unable to watch this final act of legal crucifixion. That name, Samuel da Costa, would be forever stained, associated with a crime he never committed. The legacy of a good man was being destroyed by a signature. Affiliation, the clerk continued in the same bureaucratic voice. Pastor in charge of the Seed of Hope community. The mention of the church's name caused some members in the audience to let out a stifled sob. It was the name they loved so much, the place that represented refuge, faith, and family. To hear that name in such a sordid context was like a profanation, but the clerk's voice didn't stop. He was just doing his duty, reading the information in the case file. The judge remained motionless, his impatience beginning to turn into irritation at the delay of this formality. He wanted to get it over with, and then came the words that would change everything. Located at 72 Acacia Street. Upon hearing the street name and number, something shattered in Judge Arnaldo's steel facade. The pen, which had been so firm in his hand, froze millimeters from the paper. His face, once a mask of severity and irritation, suddenly lost all its color. He turned pale so drastically that even the prosecutor sitting next to him noticed the change and looked at him with concern. The judge's expression went from indifference to absolute shock, as if he had taken an invisible punch to the gut. The world around him seemed to disappear. He raised his head slowly, and his gaze now was completely different. There was no more contempt, no more anger. There was a dazed confusion, a disbelief that bordered on panic. He looked at Samuel, but not as a judge looks at a defendant. He looked at him as if he were seeing a ghost, as if trying to fit an impossible piece into a puzzle that had just shattered in his mind. Acacia Street, number 72. That information, a mere procedural detail, had detonated a bomb in his memories, bringing to the surface an image, a sound, a desperation he tried to forget every day. The judge's voice, when it finally came, was almost unrecognizable, weak, trembling, stripped of all its former authority. "Pastor," he said, the word sounding strange in his mouth. He swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on Samuel, searching for a confirmation, a denial, anything. "A few months ago, and there was a serious accident on that street. A young man named Lucas. He had a severe asthma attack." Every word was an effort, as if he were confessing a painful secret. The prosecutor stared at him, understanding nothing. Sarah opened her eyes, confusion replacing her pain. What was happening? Samuel, who had prepared for the worst, just watched him with the same imperturbable serenity. He said nothing he didn't need to. The truth was revealing itself in a way he could never have planned. He remembered that day perfectly. The rush, the boy's mother screaming for help, the panic in the air. He remembered running to the boy, lying on the sidewalk, struggling to breathe, his face already turning blue. He didn't know who the boy was, or where he came from. He only saw a life slipping away, and acted as his faith had taught him, with love and service. The judge continued, his voice choked. With emotion, the question coming out like a desperate plea. "Was it you? Was it you who saved him? Who performed first aid until the ambulance arrived?" The question was not for the court. It was for himself, for his conscience, for the God he perhaps no longer even believed in. In that instant, the powerful Judge Arnaldo was just a father, reliving the worst day of his life, the day he almost lost his only son, Lucas. He remembered the call from the hospital, the doctor's voice saying, "If it weren't for the man who helped him on the scene, your son wouldn't have survived." He never knew who that man was. The family, in the midst of the chaos, never managed to find him to thank him. Faced with the direct question, Samuel did not answer with words. He just tilted his head gently, a simple gesture of confirmation, a nod that carried the weight of a silent miracle. There was no pride in his gesture, no accusation. There was only the truth, pure and simple. The same serenity that the judge had interpreted as arrogance was now the irrefutable proof of a character he had been unable to see. The man he was about to condemn, to humiliate, to lock behind bars, was his own son's guardian angel. The irony was so overwhelming, so divine, that the air left the judge's lungs. The judge rose from his chair, but not with the authority of before. He stood up like a broken, staggering man. His hands trembled uncontrollably. He looked at the prosecutor, at the clerk, at the audience, but his eyes seemed to register nothing. He could only see Samuel's calm face, the face of the man to whom he owed his son's life. The justice of men, with its reports, its laws, and its prejudices, had collided head-on with the justice of God, and the result was devastating. The gavel he was so eager to strike now seemed to weigh a ton, a symbol of his own blindness and arrogance. The entire room held its breath, witnessing the deconstruction of a man. Judge Arnaldo put his hands to his face, gesture of deep shame and shock. The system he so defended, which he believed to be infallible, had just shown itself to be terribly flawed, almost leading him to commit the greatest injustice of his life. He was about to destroy the life of the man who had saved his. The silent echo of that act of kindness, performed months earlier without expecting anything in return, resonated in that courtroom with the force of thunder, breaking the pride, the certainty, and the coldness of a hardened heart. The true sentence on that day would no longer come from the judge. It had already been given. A deep, heavy silence fell over the courtroom. It was a silence unlike any other that had filled that room. It was not one of expectation, nor of fear, but of awe. The revelation hung in the air, so thick it could be cut with a knife. Judge Arnaldo remained standing, motionless, the figure of authority crumbling before everyone's eyes. He lowered his hands from his face and looked at Samuel, and for The first time he did not see a defendant. He saw a man of faith, a man of honor, a man to whom he owed an unpayable debt. The shame burned on his face, visible to all. The prosecutor was paralyzed, her mouth slightly agape in shock. Her entire case, built with such certainty and disdain, had disintegrated in an instant. Her words, "a wolf in sheep's clothing," now sounded like blasphemy. She looked at the papers on her desk, at the police report that had seemed so convincing minutes ago, and it all seemed ridiculous, a poorly written fiction. She felt the weight of her own prejudice, of her rush to condemn. In that moment she was not a representative of justice, but an accomplice in a cruel farce that had almost ended in tragedy. Her easy victory had turned into a crushing moral defeat. With a trembling gesture, Judge Arnaldo picked up the gavel. The sound of the wood hitting the base was not the sharp, authoritarian strike of a sentence, but a dull thud, almost an apology. His voice, when he spoke, was hoarse, laden with a weight no one had ever heard him carry. "This trial is vacated," he declared, the words coming out with difficulty. "I identify serious inconsistencies in the investigation and a fundamental miscarriage of justice." He didn't need to give more details. Everyone in the room knew that the miscarriage of justice was him, his own blindness, his own hardened heart. It was a public confession, disguised in legal terms. He then turned to the guards, his tone now an unquestionable command, but without its former arrogance. "Release this man, immediately." The guards, who had also witnessed the scene in astonishment, moved quickly. The sound of keys turning in the lock of the handcuffs and the click of the metal opening echoed through the hall. It was the sound of freedom, but also the sound of a truth coming to light. When the handcuffs fell from Samuel's hands, the sound seemed to free not only him, but the entire room from the suffocating tension. Samuel massaged his wrists, not with anger, but with a calm that seemed even deeper now. Sarah, in the audience, finally let the tears flow freely. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of a faith that had been tested to its limit and had emerged victorious. She saw her husband free, his honor restored in the most unexpected and divine way possible. It was not a legal argument that saved him, not the eloquence of a lawyer. It was his character, an act of love planted. Months before, that blossomed in the darkest moment to bear the fruit of justice. She looked up to the heavens through the courtroom ceiling and gave thanks in silence. God's answer did not come in her time, but it arrived at the exact moment, in a way no one could have imagined. Judge Arnaldo descended from his elevated platform, a symbolic act of humility. He walked slowly toward Samuel, stopping a few feet away. The entire room watched in absolute silence. The judge looked at the pastor and his eyes were teary. "Pastor," he began, his voice failing, I have no words. What I almost did." He couldn't finish the sentence. The enormity of his error suffocated him. "My son, Lucas, he talks about you, about the man who calmed him, who prayed with him while he couldn't breathe. He calls you an angel." The judge's confession was the final testimony, the proof that Samuel's light shone even when he didn't know who was watching. Samuel, seeing the agony and shame in that man, felt no triumph. He felt compassion. He took a step forward and extended his hand, the same hand that had saved the judge's son, the same hand that had been cuffed. "Justice belongs to God, Your Honor. Today he just reminded us of that," Samuel said, with a soft, peacemaking voice. Judge Arnaldo looked at the outstretched hand and, after a moment's hesitation, shook it. The handshake between the judge who almost condemned and the man he almost destroyed was a seal of reconciliation, a powerful image of forgiveness and redemption that no one there would ever forget. Upon leaving the courthouse, Samuel was greeted by his community with hugs, tears, and songs of praise. He was not an acquitted defendant. He was a hero, a living testimony to the power of faith. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The story of the pastor who, by the hand of God, transformed the heart of a ruthless judge became a local legend, a source of hope for all who felt forgotten and wronged. His community kitchen received more donations than ever, and the young people he counseled now saw him not just as a pastor, but as a spiritual giant. The ordeal did not destroy him, it magnified him. For Judge Arnaldo, that day marked a profound and painful transformation. He took a leave of absence from the court for a while. He spent weeks in reflection, reviewing not only Samuel's case, but hundreds of others he had judged with the same blind certainty. He was forced to confront his own prejudices, the arrogance that came with power. When he returned to work, he was a different man, quieter, more humble, more willing to listen. His colleagues noticed the change. Judge Arnaldo's heavy hand had been replaced by scales that now weighed not only the law but also mercy. Samuel's life didn't change because he gained power or wealth. It changed because his greatest trial became his greatest testimony. The injustice that threatened to bring him down ended up solidifying the faith of his entire community. He never spoke of the incident with bitterness. On the contrary, he told the story as an example of how God works in mysterious ways, of how an act of love, even if small and anonymous, can echo through time and space to bring about divine justice. He continued his work on Acacia Street, serving his soup, counseling his youth, being the same seed of hope as always, but now his light shone even brighter. Weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, an unexpected figure appeared at the door of the Seed of Hope Church. It was Judge Arnaldo, accompanied by his son Lucas. They were not there on an official visit, but as a father and son coming to give thanks. Lucas ran to hug Samuel, a gesture of pure, childlike gratitude that silenced everyone preparing for the service. Arnaldo, with humble eyes, just watched the scene. The man he almost sentenced to prison was now his son's hero. On that day, the barrier between the court and the community, between law and faith, was broken by a hug. The judge was never the same. He not only changed his stance in his judgments, but also began to use his influence to promote real change. He initiated a program to review sentences based on flimsy evidence and questionable police reports, especially in cases involving minorities. He visited Samuel's community kitchen, not as an authority, but as a volunteer, helping to serve meals. The man who lived on a pedestal of power came down to walk among the people he once judged with. Such distance, learning that true justice requires compassion and proximity. For the Seed of Hope community, Samuel's testimony became an anchor. Whenever someone faced an injustice, an illness, or a trial that seemed insurmountable, they remembered that day in court. They remembered how their pastor's quiet, unwavering faith was more powerful than the judicial system. The story was told and retold, not to glorify a man, but to glorify the God who acts in mysterious and perfect ways, who uses the humble to confound the wise and powerful. Their faith was no longer theoretical. It had a face, a name, and a real story. The impact of that day reverberated beyond the walls of the courthouse and the church. The story was discreetly reported in a local newspaper, without the more dramatic details, but enough to spark conversations. Other lawyers and activists began to look more closely at cases judged by Judge Arnaldo before his transformation, raising questions about how many other injustices might have been committed. Samuel's release was not just an isolated act of divine justice, it was the stone that started an avalanche, forcing a system to look at its own flaws. On that day, in a court of men, justice did not come from the power of a gavel, but from the silent echo of an act of love, proving that the true sentence on a man's worth is written by God long before any earthly judgment. The mark left by that event was indelible, a sacred scar on the lives of all involved, an eternal reminder that when human justice fails, the divine reveals itself in ways our vain wisdom could never predict. If you know someone who needs their faith strengthened, please share this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about how faith in God can move mountains. Thank you for listening.